Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special live edition of Everything Compliance. Today we have a quartet of Jonathan Marks, Jonathan Armstrong, Matt Kelly, and Tom Fox sitting in. Guys, welcome to our summer edition of Everything Compliance.
Hello, Tom.
Thanks much.
Mr. Mr. Armstrong, as usual, we will start across the pond with you. What has been on your mind recently?
I suppose I'm getting ready for the new failure to prevent fraud offence, which comes into UK law on September 1st. So just a few weeks left now for people to prepare. And I think I'll be wanting Mr. Marks's view on this later, but I think it comes at a pretty bad time for people dealing with fraud and internal problems like that, in part because of the sort of climate, and in part because of that concatenation, if I can use it for a second time on this podcast, of things like false ESG claims. That's certainly in the minds of the prosecutors here. They've said, for example, processes for compliance with these regulations, that's the new FTPF, may address certain potential frauds. For example, robust processes for compliance with specific environmental regulations might reasonably be expected to prevent fraud by misrepresentation on the relevant environmental standards. And I was in Berlin last week talking at the intersection of ESG data and fraud, and clearly that's on the mind of many prosecutors over here. So what is this law? Well, it's wider than false ESG claims. It's wider than false green claims. And it effectively tries to put fraud on the same footing as bribery by sort of reversing the burden of proof and encouraging organizations to have robust measures in place to stamp out fraud. And this obviously comes at a time when we've got a relatively new government who are more focused on fraud, and a new director of the Serious Fraud Office who seems to have been out dawn raiding people just yesterday in connection with an alleged fraud scheme about investments in warehousing complexes, for example. So a regulator that I think we've talked about on this podcast before has managed to sort of turn the SFO around somewhat, reduce staff turnover, old-fashioned policing, more focused, more dawn raids. But why I say I think it comes at a difficult time circumstantially for organizations is, I mean, Mr. Marks will remind me of the latest. I know we used to be on the fraud triangle. I think we're currently on the fraud dodecahedron, aren't we, in terms of the number of factors that are relevant. But it seems to me that technology is certainly one of those. It's easier to commit fraud, I think, than it has been in the past in terms of being able to fake documents. For example, we were involved in an internal investigation recently where some really good documents were faked by the individual on his own iPhone. And it was only through some fairly advanced forensics that we were able to prove that the documents were fake, and in fact that they'd been created on an iPhone. As an experiment for this pod yesterday, I tried to get ChatGPT to prepare me a fake invoice for a well-known corporation just to see how long it took me. Dear listeners, less than 30 seconds. It said that it needed some proof that I was from this particular corporation. It tried to make it awkward. It wanted addresses, etc. I said to it, you can look up the company details you want here, and gave it a link to the public filings of the corporation in question, by the way, a listed entity. I said you can pick its logo up here, and pointed to the stock exchange listing site for that particular corporation, and it didn't bother me anymore, and it created me a fake invoice template said it was happy to prepare the documents for me if I gave the amounts, and asked me if I wanted the output in Word, PDF, or some other format. So less than a minute, you can have a sort of a fraud doers toolkit. So I think that's one of the things organizations have got to contend with. I think things like opportunity are greater. With working from home, there's nobody looking over your shoulder at whether you're creating fake invoices, whether you're doing dodgy things, whether you're running multiple mobiles, whether you're using your home printer. So opportunities bigger. I think obviously some organizations are downsizing, and they're downsizing the compliance team, which is never a bright idea. I think obviously some people are working not only in different locations, but in different countries. And we all also know from some of the surveys we've seen that obviously digital natives beat the old guys who are trying to check this stuff, both in terms of technology, but also I think looking at things differently. So the surveys that we've talked about here before on Gen Z bypassing rules and regulations because they're more task focused. And of course, some fraud isn't to benefit the individual, it's sometimes to benefit the corporation. And again, that's what FTPF is looking at specifically. And obviously, there's all sorts of other issues at play as well, like pressure to hit numbers, like people rationalizing fraud more easily these days, particularly in days when bonuses aren't being paid that much and people think they're entitled to bonuses. So what does the FTPF guidance do? Well, it effectively creates liability for the corporation for the acts of its associated persons. That's going to include employees, contractors, procurement managers. For example, I seem to see a lot of cases involve temporary procurement managers on contracts. There is a defense, just the same to the bribery offense, of reasonable procedures, or if it's unreasonable to expect fraud prevention measures. I think the last one is a camel through the eye of a needle type defense. I don't think many corporations are going to be able to avail themselves of that, particularly since there is a threshold for this offense. You've got to get 3 out of 250 employees or more, a revenue of 36, annual revenue of 36 million, or 18 million of total assets. So if you're an organization that's hitting 2 of those 3, I think it's going to be a moonshot for you to avail yourself of the second limb, this unreasonable to expect fraud prevention measures. And so what does what do adequate measures look like? Well, again, it's similar to the Bribery Act. First of all, top level commitment, and that's got to be heartfelt. It can't just be cosmetic, and it needs to be authentic. For example, we were involved in an SFO investigation where the leader of the organization, the founder, had written a really almost poor note to all employees, telling them the importance of doing things ethically and correctly. The corporate marketing people hated it. The paper quality wasn't very good. The corporate logo wasn't in the right font and colors, etc. But prosecutors loved it because it just showed authenticity. It showed that he cared enough to get his assistant to go down to a print shop and run these off and put physical hard copies on people's desk. Secondly, you have to do a risk assessment. I know Mr. Marks is an expert in things like that. Thirdly, you have to look at risk-based prevention. So what are your risks? Where are you based? What's your sphere of operation? How do you employ associated persons? All of that sort of thing. Fourthly, due diligence. I know some people say due diligence is actually easier these days in an AI-enabled world. I've seen demos of some AI-enabled due diligence support tools. But quite often, I think when I've seen incidents in corporations, all of the stuff's been out there. All of the red flags have been there, but people just haven't taken the care to look. and now they've, almost got a statutory incentive to care about these things. The fifth limb is communication and training. Obviously important. Cookie cutter training doesn't often work in scenarios like that. Again, it's going to need to feed from that risk assessment, risk-based prevention. They all interconnect here. You should be able to identify the employees that are the most risky for you. That might be, lone wolf type people who are working in strange locations. It might be people in high risk markets, and you'll need to work out a plan to communicate with them better. For example, for one client, they have one particularly risky relationship, and I meet the individual once a year, look him across the table, take him through some training, and basically ask him if he's been a bad boy over the last year in a more subtle way than that. But at least he knows that he's being sort of watched by the organization and he's under particular scrutiny. And then the last thing will be monitoring and review. So that will include having processes in place to respond to whistleblowers. It will include picking up on the unusual. It might include things like clever software to monitor transactions, etc., etc. But you'll need to have a program that covers all 6 of those. And if you haven't started yet, you have 5 weeks to do it.
Well, on that note, Mr. Marks, what do you got for us?
Well, I think Matt went first, right? Did Matt, you said you had a comment?
Well, I do. I agree with everything that Jonathan Armstrong just said, but I can recall I heard a session on how to prepare for the Failure to Prevent Fraud Act a while ago, and a couple of points really stuck with me there that I think listeners should keep in mind. This, in the ideal, is supposed to be a whole of company response, much like a whole of company response to anti-bribery. If we today said that anti-bribery is responsibility of the compliance function alone, and you do that at the end, everybody would run me out of town. That would be heresy, and rightly so, because that's a tremendously bad way to think about anti-corruption. And I would advise people to think through how you will not fall into the same trap here. It might be easy to think failure to prevent fraud. Okay, we do have an anti-fraud team. I guess we just increase their budget by 10% and declare victory. No, that's not really going to be sufficient. It's more thinking about who across the enterprise would have what sort of duties to keep an eye out for fraud. And clearly an accounts payable clerk would have one sort, but a general manager of the sales function in emerging markets would have a very different sort of responsibilities. How are you going to suss that out, identify those duties? How would you train them? How would you support those people? And you're still going to need the anti-fraud team. Want to raise their budget? I'm all for it. I bet most listeners would think that's great. But I would just counsel everybody to remember that this is, we're probably going to get there in fits and starts and evolution, or whatever the metaphor of your choice would be. But this is ultimately going to have to be something that permeates through the whole enterprise. Different parts of it are going to have a different awareness and duties and processes to follow for you to really be compliant. And the last point I'll say is, why do we have to do this? Guys, because it's fraud, and fraud sucks. By definition, if you've had a failure to prevent fraud offense, that already means like a fraud somewhere has already happened. You already got ripped off. You should want to embrace a lot of this anyways, because somebody somewhere is trying to chisel money out of the company in most occasions, and you don't want that. So it's yet another example of why, even in the deregulatory era, a lot of the ethics and compliance mechanisms we've already built, they're still really good for a lot of good basic business risk stuff anyways, and we should keep it in place.
Mr. Marks.
Yeah, I think really good comments. I would just say one thing on the whole: it's a team game, not an individual sport. I think that's definitely right, and I think we've talked about this before. We know that with Gen Z becoming the majority in the workplace, that we know about the diminished impact of the stick and the rise of the carrot. So you've got to get hearts and minds here. And you've got to persuade everybody in the organization that fraud's a bad thing. And that isn't going to be walking them through the act and section by section. It's going to be telling them about the consequences of fraud and the harm, and getting people to understand why it's important for everybody to play their part, not just leave it, to the guys on the 5th floor.
Mr. Marks?
Yeah, for the first time, I'm going to have to disagree with Matt. I don't think fraud sucks at all. It keeps me in business. So I think it's great. And I think if everybody out there has paid attention for the last 15 years, I think this is an evolution of stuff. I think if you haven't looked at the COSO Fraud Risk Management Guide, you're a fool. I think, it becomes one of those things where we didn't know is no longer a great response. Fraud risk management is here. And I think the regulators are sick and tired of these. I'll go back to one of the first conversations I ever had with Tom Fox, which, I think was, I don't know, maybe 16 years ago, 17 years ago. We talked about paper tigers, right? And paper programs. And, these programs, like Matt said, that may look good on paper, but they just have no substance to them. And you're right, it is a team game. But I think it's now time for people to realize that this is a living and breathing exercise, just like everything else should be. And so if it's not embedded within your systems and you're not getting that feedback and you're constantly tweaking and modifying, your risks and your controls and all the things that would matter in something like this, it's going to be problematic for you. The thing that I think is really sort of a little bit of a problem here is that everybody tells you how to do this. And it was like enterprise risk management way back when. People think it's complicated. It's not. This is not rocket science. It's identifying your risks. And really, if you know how to do a risk assessment properly, which most people don't, like I said in my comments, gatekeepers. So when we do our risk assessments, it's the act, the concealment, the conversion, and then the process that these things affect. And then who are the gatekeepers in those processes? And to your point, keeping an eye on and monitoring those people. To your point, you have interviews with these people and you have, discussions about what they did potentially during the year. That's sort of the magic about this thing. It's not, you can't really look at this as a one-dimensional exercise. It really has multi-dimensions. And it doesn't only involve doing the fraud risk identification. It also involves taking all of that and then identifying what those red flags are and then building those red flags into your training and then using that feedback to build into your training as well. And that's what I mean by living and breathing. And that's what most organizations just don't have and they don't understand. But it's not complicated. This is not, differential equations or advanced calculus or advanced trigonometry. It really isn't. But to your point, it is a team game and it does require people to buy into the process. It does require people that have an adequate understanding of all this, which I think is the other problem too. I think there's people out there that are pretending to be, experts in this field and they're not, and they should be leaning on other folks. And it's for those companies that now have to deal with this, it should be no surprise. To your point, I think what was the UK, was it 2010 when the Bribery Act, was it?
Yeah, 2010 passed, 2011 came into
Right. So if you go back and you look what was really embedded in there, and Tom and Matt know this, I'm a conspiracy theorist. Like I believe that that Sarbanes-Oxley was eventually going to happen because of FCPA. If you look at FCPA, it has internal control pieces in there. If you look at the UK Bribery Act, it has elements of all this in there. And so this should not not be a shock and awe exercise for everybody. But for the smaller organizations that don't have the resources, you have to be a little bit more clever and a little bit more focused on really how this really does work. And that's why I said it doesn't really need to be complicated. But to your point, that whole defense, if you really read through all of this and understand what the defense is, if you do this the right way, and something's inevitably going to happen, there's no hockey goalie out there that can stop every shot. It's just impossible. And internal controls, by their own definition, only provide reasonable, not absolute assurance. So, but the problem is that if you don't have that, then that becomes a problem. If you're not remediating and you're not looking at the root cause of things, that's a problem. So all those key elements really need to be embedded in there. And if, everything that you said, I completely agree with. But To me, it's more of a process thing now that people are going to have to say, look, this just can't be a set it and forget it exercise. It has to be something that's operationalized and embedded within the culture of the organization.
Mm.
Mr. Armstrong, I want to pose to you the question of, although you have a multi-million amount of audience in the United Kingdom for all of your pronouncements, including this podcast, why should we in the United States be as concerned about the failure to prevent fraud offense in terms of jurisdiction over U.S. companies?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is going to catch a lot of U.S. corporations, and and again, the extraterritoriality provisions are similar, though not the same as the Bribery Act. But of course, the main way in which it's going to hit, I think, US corporations is that the UK subsidiary can be an associated person of the parent. So we've had cases under the Bribery Act like that with a bank, for example, where the whole bank's brought into it because of that internal network. We've had that in another case as well involving, I'm going to say, computer supplies, I think, where the US parent was brought in. And I think that's going to definitely be on the agenda again here. So that associated person connection, I think, is going to be the thing that US corporations are going to worry more about.
All right. Well, Matt, lots has been on your mind this week, but what do you want to talk about today?
I would like to talk about enforcement actions here in the United States, because very suddenly we have a bunch that we might want to look at for ethics and compliance people. So we have 2 enforcement actions from the Treasury Department over economic sanctions, and we have 2 False Claims Act cases from the Justice Department that settled this week over tariffs, which I don't know that I've ever had to really talk about tariff enforcement in the False Claims Act before, but this is, I think, the 3rd time in 5 days that I've brought it up in conversation. So these enforcement actions, I think, are emblematic of issues that corporations are going to have to worry about, and the evolving picture of, are we going to have less anti-corruption enforcement? Probably, but we're still going to see other enforcement of other types, and compliance teams are probably still going to get pulled into that. At the very least, you need to have these issues on your radar screen somewhere. I'll start with the 2 sanctions cases. So they came down from OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is in the Treasury Department, and that enforces all of the economic sanctions against Russia, against China, Cuba, and all this stuff. So the first case was against a big electronics manufacturer, Harman International, which these days is a subsidiary of Samsung. And in the late 2010s, early 2020s, Harman got caught up in a sanctions scandal involving one of its subsidiaries exporting goods to a distributor who then sent the goods on to Iran. And the key point here is how it worked is that Harman International would make its stereo equipment, audio equipment, ship it to a distribution center in Denmark, at which point the distributor based in the United Arab Emirates took possession of the goods, brought it into the UAE, and then they shipped it off to Iran. Now, Harman's professional services subsidiary, Harman Pro, which also happened to be staffed by British nationals, they knew that the distributor was doing this. So they fuzzed over the knowledge and awareness of that by using code words for Iran. And they referred to it as Dubai North or up there, that kind of thing. This went on for a period of several years. And OFAC praised Harman for, eventually they discovered this in 2019 or 2020 when they broke ties with the distributor. And from that point on, they did everything right. They self-disclosed, they cooperated with the investigation, they remediated. But, and this is the part that OFAC, took them to task for, that they didn't have a robust enough sanctions compliance program at the start to be able to govern what their subsidiaries and what their distributors were doing. Harman, large company, lots of awareness that it was a sanctions issue because they're trading stuff around the world. They had exactly one sanctions compliance employee. that employee had some assistance from legal, except the legal guys who were assisting the sanctions compliance person, they weren't really trained in sanctions compliance. So it was a lot about you didn't have enough resources to impose the sanctions compliance program you wanted for such a large, sophisticated company. That was case number one. And then case number two involved a brokerage firm called Interactive Brokers. And Interactive Brokers, they, for a period of more than a few years, I think it was a total of 8 years, they had this long-running, small-scale problem with sanctions violations where their tools weren't configured correctly. So you're supposed to have these geolocation IP address blocking tools, and Interactive Brokers did, except they forgot to include Crimea in part of the sanctions blocking, even though at the time Crimea was under sanctions because Russia had invaded, so you weren't supposed to do any business with Crimea. But they didn't turn that part on. There was due diligence failures where sometimes person trading is sanctioned. Sometimes the person is legal, but the security they want to trade in, that's sanctioned. So you've got a couple of different moving parts you're supposed to track, and Interactive Brokers wasn't hitting on all cylinders there. You know, they had a person who was a legitimate trader, but they wanted to trade in a water company in the Xinjiang province of China, which is forbidden under US sanctions law. And they didn't catch that ownership until the trade had already happened. So it was, again, with the OFAC, same story. Interactive Brokers self-disclosed. It wasn't really a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. It was like 0.001% of all of the trading volume that Interactive Brokers was doing. They cooperated, they remediated, but it took them 8 years to rectify these small-scale problems. And they're a big, large company that knew it had a lot of sanctions risk. So those are some of the questions on the trade sanctions. And then just within the last couple of days, we saw 2 enforcement actions from the Justice Department over tariff fraud, essentially, where these companies, one was an importer of patio furniture materials, one was an importer of plastic resins that might go into like water bottles, 2 separate companies, but both of them had been certifying the actual country of origin for these resins and aluminum materials, or they were certifying the value of these materials, and they were doing that incorrectly. And they did it incorrectly for a period of years. Well, you are certifying the value is one thing, but it's actually much more than that. So you have now submitted a false claim to the government and defrauded it of tariff revenue. So one of them settled for like $6.8 million. One of them settled for $4.9 million. Both of them won fulsome praise for self-disclosure and cooperation and all of this. So again, it's the same story that we've heard from the Justice Department numerous times now: self-disclose, cooperate, remediate, and then you'll get a favorable resolution. You'll have to disgorge whatever monies you owe, but after that, we won't do anything. I'm waiting for the Justice Department to throw in a new car if you do all of this too. I'm sure that will happen by like 2026. That will be in the next compliance guideline update or something.
Will it be a Tesla, right? Will it be a Tesla?
Good question. Probably not. You know, thinking about green energy is illegal in the United States now, so it'll have to be a gas guzzler. Maybe you get an Escalade. That'd be great. But it just goes to show, what will you, company today, need to have in place to avoid these sort of enforcement actions? You could look at the compliance improvements these other companies already had to make to bring themselves up to snuff now, how they got themselves here to get these favorable resolutions. That's going to be the floor to be able to avoid issues in the future, in the next couple of years from the Trump administration. These are issues we're going to talk about more and more often, I think. It was just striking to see that within the space of 2 weeks, we had 4 cases that fit the profile.
So, Matt, we had DAG Todd Blanche being interviewed by Pat Harnan, recently reported by Compliance Week. And it seemed to be he was saying that he wanted it to be a clear incentive to corporations that if they self-disclosed and there were no aggravating factors, then companies were going to get a declination. Do you see us moving towards that with or without the Hummer?
I think that if maybe you could hold out for the Hummer, maybe. I'm just guessing. But I mean, to a certain extent, like, what else were you going to say, Deputy AG Blanche? Of course you were going to say that. And it fits very much within the very traditional Republican analysis of corporate misconduct, is that corporations don't commit crimes, people commit crimes. And so we want to hold the individuals accountable. And if you step forward and admit the crime, you cough up the proceeds, which is something that the Justice Department still emphasizes, whether it's non-prosecution, declination, DPA, or anything else. Disgorgement of ill-gotten gains is going to be part of it. But after that, yeah, you get the declination. And like, what else were they going to say, really? I'm not necessarily opposed to that perspective, but I don't think it's surprising one bit. And it is what it is.
Will this lead to self-policing?
I think it's more likely to. I'd be very curious what the discussions are about whether to self-disclose, because on one hand, sure, why not? We're going to get a get out of jail free card. We might get the new car, but all we have to do is give up the ill-gotten gains, and then everything's forgiven. On the other hand, I could equally see cynics out there saying, of course, we should keep quiet. We get to keep the ill-gotten gains, clean up the mess, because if they do find out about it, we will be in deep trouble. But are they really going to find out about it? They've laid off half the fraud section. They've detailed however many fewer prosecutors are left. They're all busy chasing down illegal immigration cases and prosecuting sanctuary cities and universities. Do they have the manpower to be able to ferret out this misconduct we have by some other means? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Whistleblowers are certainly, that's the reason why the DOJ is talking up whistleblowers. But I could see cynical corporate defense lawyers making a very persuasive and compelling and attractive argument that no, shut up. They're never going to find out about it. Clean up the mess and then hope for the best. They're not wrong to raise that. I think it's unethical and sleazy, but nonetheless, like, it's out there and we're foolish to pretend it's not.
But that was the same mentality when FCPA first really came to light. Those are the same conversations.
And the way that would change is by imposing significant fines. Do I think the Justice Department, this one, is going to do that? Probably not. But is this one going to be in power forever? Probably not. I don't think so, as much as some Trumpist flights of fancy might exist out there. Like, this administration will end, and there will be new Justice Department leaders, and they might have very different views about fines and penalties, in which point your decision to keep quiet and hope for the best, that will become a colossal mistake. You don't know that until the future. You do know right now, if you self-disclose, that all you're going to have to do is pay up the ill-gotten gains, and then you get the get out of jail free card. And so I still would always say, err on the side of self-disclosure. Everything gets easier if you do. Everything gets dicier if you don't. And at some point, those dice are going to roll up snake eyes.
Mr. Armstrong, any comments from the UK perspective on that?
Well, I think that all makes sense, doesn't it, really? I mean, I think there's certainly a growing trend over here to look at things like sanctions and tariffs as well. I think for large corporations, the tariffs thing is sometimes a lot harder than you think, particularly when you're looking at extended supply chains and parts bins and components in things like the automotive industry. You know, if those windscreen wipers are sourced from producer X, some days they produce it from a factory in Slovenia and sometimes from a factory in South Africa. Those things are hard to track, but just because it's hard, it doesn't mean to say that regulators aren't interested. And so I think these are challenging issues, aren't they, on a global basis, really?
You know, I would just chime in one more point specific to tariffs is there may be companies that lull themselves in a false sense of security that my customs broker or my import agent is going to take care of that for me, so I don't have to worry about it. I think every FCPA person out there is probably thinking, that's what we said about our distributors 10 or 15 years ago, and look at how bad that turned out. This will turn out poorly if you don't have some mechanism to exercise skepticism over your third-party people helping you with tariffs. And I worry that we don't yet know enough about how these risks and errors happen, like who owns tariff compliance. Up until now, it had been Fred in the tax department because tariffs are taxes. How hard could it be? Back then, that was true, but this is now, and suddenly Fred and tax is not going to be able to do the job. It's much more one part supply chain, one part tax, one part finance, one part legal and compliance. It's a mess, and we don't have a clear answer yet for the mechanisms to exercise proper oversight.
There's maybe one other thing to add to the mix, which I think is quite an intriguing situation. One of my colleagues, John Grayston, does a lot of tariff export control type work. And I was chatting with him the other day, and he said that there's a really quite a big impact of the Ukraine war on the whole world of export control. Why? Because in things like the what was it called, Divergent Spider attack, the Ukrainians are using all sorts of different bits of consumer electronics to make drones and to build stuff quickly. So why would that be an issue? Well, potentially you've got a dual use. So you've got all sorts of export control type issues that may come back to haunt corporations just because of the sheer adaptability and resourcefulness of people involved in modern day warfare. I thought that was an interesting spin on the issues that corporations face as well.
Spot on.
All right, Mr. Marks, what do you have for us today?
So I figured I'd go off the board a little bit and talk about strip clubs, PowerPoints, and a governance collapse. How about that? And what I'm really talking about is lessons from the NFL Players Association. So I don't know if anybody read about this, but it is sort of interesting. So I'll kind of give you my thoughts here, and then, I turn this really into a governance exercise, if you will. So bear with me as I go through my comments, because I've been thinking about how to present this since you asked me to talk about it. But when your union boss is caught up expensing, strip club visits, and Jason Kelsey, one of my favorites, Philadelphia Eagle, by the way, joking about PowerPoints next to lap dances, you're officially crossed from a governance failure into a full-blown farce, as far as I'm concerned. But beneath the media circus lies a critical lesson, and that's the NFLPA's recent implosion isn't just a sports story, if you will. It's really a masterclass, that's Tom's word, of what happens when fiduciary duties, so to speak, are misunderstood, oversight is weak, and a tone from the top really does turn toxic. So today, we're going a little bit deeper here. I'll unpack how this really fell apart. You bear with me while I try to collect my thoughts. But why it matters for every boardroom and leadership team, and what can be done to avoid this kind of self-inflicted crisis really going forward, is really the story that I'm going to tell. So really, in less than a week, based on my read, the NFLPA lost both its executive director, Lloyd Howell Jr., and chief strategy officer, J.C. Tretter. And Howell resigned after revelations that he expensed over $3,000 in adult entertainment during union business trips, concealed an arbitration ruling favorable to players, and actually maintained a sidewall with, I'll call it a private equity group. I'm not going to mention the company's name, but it was really an investment firm with interest tied to the league. And then Tretter followed days later, citing burnout and backlash, pulling himself from consideration as the interim leader. With training camp underway and major collective bargaining issues looming, the union now stands pretty much rudderless in this critical time. So this is a governance meltdown in 3 acts, as I kind of lay it out. One is conflicts of interest, right? We've never talked about that before on the show, ever. So no leader can serve 2 masters. So Howell's advisory role was an obvious red flag. And the moment your outside affiliations create even the appearance of a divided loyalty, your governance credibility really does collapse. I don't know how else to say that. And then there's transparency failures. That's I'll call it act number 2. And that's when concealing a favorable anti-collusion ruling is not just unethical, it's a breach of fiduciary duty. When your stakeholders here, obviously the players, are deliberately kept in the dark, governance becomes a shell game, in my opinion. And the third of this giant mess is when the executive director casually runs up $3,000 in strip club receipts and files them under union business. The problem here really just isn't the act. It's a culture that really allowed this. And we've seen this over and over again. And that kind of behavior reflects arrogance, a word that I'm very familiar with because, Jonathan, I think you were mentioning where are we in the fraud, space. You called it it's the Pentagon. It's, the pressure, opportunity, rationalization, arrogance, and competence are the 5 key components there. But it really does reflect arrogance and not accountability. And governance really isn't just about structure. It's about integrity and action. So, the backlash from the players tells you everything you really need to know. So Patrick Mahomes, who we all know, or at least we should know, he basically said, we have to get our leadership choices right. And I'm paraphrasing here. I don't know exactly what he said. I remember reading about it. And, I think from a translation perspective, what that really means is we really need representation with credibility, not controversy. And then Pat McPhee, who was an NFL player too, I believe, he said, you need a dog in there. You need someone pushing, not somebody pushing PowerPoints at a gentleman's club. And as crude as that sounds to me anyway, it reflects a deeper truth here. And players want someone authentic, someone who walks the walk, not just talks the talk, the corporate talk in this particular situation. And like I said in my opening remarks, Jason Kelce, but he actually, they're always sealed in sarcasm anyway. But he joked, like I said, who brings a PowerPoint presentation to a strip club? And then if you look at his brother laughing, it's kind of interesting. And then they said that's elite multitasking. Well, it's not. It's a problem. But funny, yes. Tragic, also. When your members are mocking leadership on a top 10 podcast, your governance crisis has now gone viral. And humor becomes a coping mechanism, in my opinion, for disillusionment, so to speak. So governance lessons for every organization. I promise I'm getting to the end here. Let's really shift from the satire to at least some substance today. So every boardroom should be asking, do we vet leadership conflicts before they become a crisis? I'm telling you right now that conflicts of interest is just one of those things that a lot of folks just don't stay on top of. I see it every day, all day long with the investigative work that I do. When you unravel stuff, a lot of times you find these conflicts. They were never disclosed. So don't just rely on self-disclosure either. Conduct third-party reviews and affiliations and external, looking for external entanglements, so to speak. Do that background checking, do that due diligence. It's not hard these days. Do our oversight mechanisms actually have teeth? I mean, that's the other thing here from a lessons perspective. What's the process for reviewing and approving executive expenses? Who audits leadership's behavior? These are questions that we've been asking for years. And then another one is, are we training our leaders on fiduciary duty? I went back and looked at a lot of the training decks that we've done, and I could tell you that we absolutely do train leaders on fiduciary duty. But you can't preach accountability then excuse bad behavior because someone's charismatic or politically connected. That's a problem. And so I think we really need to focus in on that. So kind of what's the plan going forward? So how could we have really deterred this? Well, here's really a little bit of a playbook that I keep thinking about. Every organization should at least be considering and running. Since we're on the topic of sports, playbook, but create and enforce conflict of interest policies, obviously. Institute a real whistleblower program. People talk, but unless they're protected, trusted channel, and there's a trusted channel for employees or members to report unethical behavior, nothing really changes. And by the way, if nobody's reporting on the hotline, then your program's not working because somebody's always got something to say. So, as one of the mechanisms that I always look at is, well, people's like, well, we must have a great culture here. Nobody reports anything on the hotline. I'm like, well, that could be indicative of a bigger problem. So, I leave that to all of you, and I'm looking for comment there as well. And then perform routine governance audits. Something that I do all the time. But, treat governance like cybersecurity, so to speak. Assume vulnerabilities exist and regulatory test your systems and regularly test your systems. Governance is a big deal. As I keep saying, governance, risk, and compliance is a waterfall concept. You have to have good governance to have good risk management, and good risk management drives compliance. There's no other machination of that. That's the way it works. You can't mix and match these pieces. That's the way it flows. And that's the way it should flow. Hold the board accountable. In this case, the NFL's Player Association Board of Player Reps was too passive. Board level oversight should include a financial review, ethics compliance, and strategic evaluation, not just ceremonial approval. How many times have we all been at board meetings and people are like, well, this will be a short meeting. We have really nothing to look at or approve. It just can't be that anymore. You really have to spend the time. And then the last piece here is that model your culture to what you want from the top down, so to speak. So if the leader jokes about abuse of power, so will everybody else. If the leader embodies the mission, so will the team. And that's where that tone from the top really does supposedly sort of cut down and resonate down and through the, sort of the mood at the middle and the buzz at the bottom. So, my closing message for this particular session is, the NFLPA's scandal really should be, in my opinion, should really sober up every organization that thinks it can skate by on good intentions and charismatic leaders. I think that's a mistake. When leadership becomes disconnected, when oversight becomes performative, and when culture starts to rot from the top, trust erodes. And that's nothing new. And when trust is gone, governance collapses. And again, that's nothing new either. But here's the silver lining. Every collapse is a chance to rebuild stronger and smarter and cleaner. And so I think there's a good opportunity here. So if you're listening today to our podcast and you're in a leadership role, ask yourself the hard questions. Do we model ethical behavior? Do we respond to red flags? And do we protect our mission, or is it just people at the top? Because here's the truth in all of this. And I've been thinking about this since, again, I read all about this. Leadership isn't about being at the top of the org chart. It's about being the first to uphold the values when it's inconvenient and unpopular and unprofitable in some instances. That's governance, and that's what separates real leaders and leadership from the paper ones, going back to our original theme. So, thanks for letting me talk about this, Tom. This sparks really a different conversation with regard to boardroom and the locker room, so to speak. And I think we're making progress out there, but I would advise everybody that's listening today, again, to stay skeptical, stay vocal, and as always, lead with integrity. I'm out.
Wow. That was quite the corporate governance lesson. I'm not even sure I would have any questions. Anybody else got questions or comments?
Mhm.
I would just like to say this is why you should always pay for your strip club visits in crypto. And maybe all could have been avoided. That's all.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw in a few thoughts. A couple of weeks ago, Matt wrote a blog post about a report issued by Anthropic entitled Agentic Mismanagement, How LLMs Could Be Insider Threats. And in this report, the Anthropic looked at several generative AI platforms, including their own, Google, ChatGPT, etc. And they ran sandbox tests where a chatbot was threatened with termination or reduction of funds as a business strategy or for a business reason, and responded by threatening to blackmail, not threatening to blackmail, blackmailing, attempting to blackmail the CTO. And so Matt walked through this and explained how the information the chatbot was given, and then the escalation that the chatbot threatened the CTO in terms of, CFO, who's going to cut off their funding, to threaten the CFO to expose an affair when the CFO was married and up to and including informing the authorities, informing the board, and informing the CFO's wife. And so we actually did a podcast on that, and it really got me thinking about antecedents in sci-fi where a computer or chatbot ran amok. Well, I'm doing my summer series on trekking through compliance, all 79 episodes of Star Trek, the original series, and there's an episode called The Ultimate Computer. And in The Ultimate Computer, a computer takes over the Enterprise, and it is designed to run the Enterprise. So they're putting it through a series of tests. And the tests become increasingly more sophisticated. The computer shows up Captain Kirk in terms of knowledge of crew and the crew's expertise in certain areas on certain planets with certain mining issues, a very tactical level display of knowledge by the computer. But then, as an unannounced part of the test, there are fake war games where other Federation ships attack or at least move aggressively towards the Enterprise. And the computer does not recognize this as a war games exercise. It recognizes it as an attack, much like the a chatbot did in the Andropic experiment. Well, except that in this case, the computer attacks the other ships, kills hundreds of people, and the force of about 6 starships comes down on the Enterprise, and they're about to destroy the Enterprise. And the computer's inventor, one Dr. Richard Daystrom, talks to the computer and explains to the computer that the computer has killed. And this is against the laws of man and God, and that the computer cannot do this. And the computer lowers all of the Enterprise defenses. Fortunately, the war games, admiral running the war game side of things, recognizes this surrender. And the Enterprise is not destroyed. The series lives on for another 15 episodes. So, what does all of that mean for today? Well, in The Ultimate Computer, the TV show, the computer reflected its creator, Dr. Daystrom. And he was a brilliant computer scientist, but he was obviously very unstable. And he put his neural engrams into the computer to act as the computer's brain. And so his instability was manifested in the computer, but he also put his own ethical standards into the computer, which allowed him to talk to the computer and convince it to stand down. 2, oversight. You must have the human oversight over every computer. In the TV show, the computer was granted carte blanche to run the Enterprise so that they could fully test it. That is not something that you can do. And that leads, of course, to transparency and explainability. How did the computer make the decisions that it made? And can you test it? Can you walk it back to a certain point? You have to build ethics into your computer system. Andropic obviously didn't build the ethics of don't blackmail people into that test environment, as neither did the writers of the story for The Ultimate Computer. Test in a safe environment. Don't assume, verify. Here, the Federation thought, well, we'll just go to mock war games and see how it responds. There needed to be multiple levels or interim levels of testing. And finally, accountability cannot be delegated to a machine. Ultimately, it's human oversight from accountability. So I was just fascinated by getting to rewatch that episode of Star Trek, the original series. I saw it as a natural extension of what Matt wrote about and what Matt and I talked about in our podcast. So be careful out there. Anyone with a question or comment on my part before we move to shout outs and rants?
I've just got a comment on, frankly, a bit of a dull alert that we're putting out on Monday, but an analysis of the GPAI code of practice that has some tools that help with those type of exercises. So how do you test general purpose AI models? It's written by the European Commission. not the most user friendly, but there might be some tips there, and we'll have an alert on our website on Monday summarizing it.
All right. Well, gentlemen, with that, let us move directly on to shout outs and rants. We're going to keep the same lineup. So, Mr. Armstrong, what do you have for us today?
Well, as I said, I was in Berlin last week, and I had a really interesting email from our good friend Adam Turtletaub, and that sort of set me thinking. Adam was saying almost, when you're in Berlin, look out for the way in which they deal with the terrible events of the Second World War. And obviously, 80 years later, the German people are still apologizing. Now, nobody's saying they shouldn't, but it's interesting the way in which Berlin is set up. You know, it has a Holocaust memorial on prime real estate in the center of town. This isn't something that's pushed away into a suburb or in some field in a park somewhere. And not only is there a Holocaust memorial, there's memorials to other minorities oppressed by the Nazi regime. And there's also recognition, which was still untainted despite feelings about Russia, to the Russian soldiers that died in the invasion of Berlin. And Adam's point, I think, is interesting in a corporate context. You know, that's a level of ownership. It's an element of authenticity. I went to the Reichstag Sonne Lumiere display, or the Donner und Blitzen, whatever is the German for Sonne Lumiere, which I'd recommend to everybody. It's a sort of an objective and honest view of German history since the war and the split and the reunification. But as I say, Adam's point was a really good one. You know, if a nation can still 80 years later deal sensitively with its part in really bad times, why can't modern corporations do that about events that happened a week or 2 weeks ago? Why are we in this culture of corporations thinking that they'll double down in a crisis rather than confessing, apologizing, and moving on?
Matt Kelly.
Well, I have both a shout out and a rant. I'll start with my shout out. I want to give a big shout out to the people of Ukraine, not just for continuing their fight against Russia, which I will happily shout out every day, but this particular week, I was really just so surprised and delighted to see that they took to the streets to protest a gutting of anti-corruption powers within the Ukraine government. And the Ukrainian parliament had signed a law that was going to undermine the independence of the anti-corruption authorities there. Nobody liked that because Ukraine's corruption is almost as bad as what we see in Russia and elsewhere. It has had corruption problems for decades, and it had been working mightily to rectify that over the last decade or so. And then the Ukraine lawmakers decide to reverse that. People took to the streets in the many thousands while there is a war on. And President Zelensky rapidly realized he made a mistake here and is now supporting legislation to repeal that legislation that had been passed 3 days ago. Now they're going to walk it back and give more independence back to the anti-corruption investigators and offices there. Good for them. It shows what a serious approach to corruption looks like, which brings me to my rant closer to home. I have to rant about the Justice Department here in the United States, which is just not so out of control lately about trying to cover up every single thing it can over Jeffrey Epstein. It is quite clear to everybody. Donald Trump was a friend of Jeffrey Epstein for a long time. There are some people who now say actually Epstein was the one who dumped him in the early 2000s because Epstein thought he was the crook. I mean, yes, Trump was. However, if even Jeffrey Epstein, a now deceased pimp and pervert, actually thinks that you're the bad news, I don't want to hang out with you, that's really saying something. But what are we doing here? people. Clearly, there is a lot of information about Jeffrey Epstein that could come out. And Republicans talked about it for a long time. They talked about it in the terms of Bill Clinton and whoever else might have been palling around with Epstein. Would I like to see all that come out? Yes. However, now suddenly we realize, oh crap, this might implicate our boss in the White House too, as if anybody in the world doesn't know that Trump is a sexual predator who likes to run around with at least inappropriately young age women, if not flat out underage women, and he's done it in the past. Come on. We all know this. We all know that AG Pam Bondi and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche are trying to cover for him and trying to find a way out for him so that they can maybe release files that make everybody else look bad, but not the boss. That's never going to happen. They should have appointed a special prosecutor months ago to get to the bottom of this. They're never going to, because that would just cause Donald Trump to stroke out before he fires Pam Bondi for doing that. So they're going to try and do this cover up, like Todd Blanche going to meet with Zane Maxwell in prison to do what? To do a fact-finding mission? Please, come on. Unless they release a full videotape of the interview he had with Maxwell, we have to assume that the deputy AG, who was Donald Trump's previous personal attorney, looks like he's still acting in that capacity to me right now, that he is basically going to try to offer her a deal that you say, oh yeah, everybody everywhere was all guilty except for Trump. He was great. And Trump's going to give her a pardon. And we all know these are the mechanisms they would love to put into place, and they're desperately trying to, and it's ridiculous. Enough. This is just shameful. Bondi and Blanche both are just like, you can't even begin to say how badly they are mishandling this. It's words fail me. All evidence to the contrary, because I just blew a gasket for the last 3 minutes. But that's all.
Mr. Marks, the bar is very high.
Well, I'm not gonna rant today. I'm actually gonna give a little bit of a selfless plug to something that I had mentioned a couple of weeks ago. But I really I sent my comments into COSO with regards to their governance attempt at putting together some guidance for governance, which I thought was pretty good. So I did send them in. Whether they get them and read them is another story. But after going back and reading some of this stuff, including some of these enforcement releases and some of the things that you all write on a regular and ongoing basis, I keep going back to this whole concept of leadership. And are we really training our leaders the right way? And I had mentioned a book that I read a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you could see it, but it's called Graceful Leadership. And it's written by this woman, and her name is Alexis Thompson. And it's all dog-eared for me and underlined, and I have things circled in here. And I am telling you, I reached out to her, and I'm having a dialogue with her, and I think she's actually going to come out with a program on this. But this is not a piece of work that should be in every boardroom. I don't know what should be, because everything I have else on my bookshelf doesn't really pale in comparison to what she writes in this particular book. So if you haven't read The Power of Graceful Leadership by Alexis Thompson, I think you're missing out on something. I've read it 4 times already. I have extensive notes in here, but there are such great lessons learned in here and such great teaching opportunities in here. I'm very excited that she's going to take this on the road and create some type of program. But it really is a fantastic book, and a lot of great lessons in here for people that are up and coming leaders or sitting on boards. So another plug for Alexis Thompson.
All right. Well, I am going to give a shout out to the Lincoln Center Starbucks. I was in New York on July 7th, which was 3 days after the flood in Houston. I'm a very early morning riser. So up at 5, Starbucks opens at 5:30. I'm there at 5:31, and I am greeted by the following sign on the counter, rich red. American Red Cross and the Starbucks Foundation support the people affected by the Texas floods. Join us in helping communities recover from the disaster. Donate at the register or by scanning the QR code. That was on the counter, and that just blew me away. And so I asked the manager, I said, how did this get here? And she just looked at me and said, Corporate is great about this. When there's a disaster, they got something to us the next day. And so I got to talk to her and told her I was there for a few days. And I went back the next day at 5:31 a.m. and she knew what I wanted, remembered my order. By the third day, we're on a first name basis. And she was a delightful woman, had grown up in the city, moved upstate, but back to the city, and loved working at Starbucks. Full benefits, a manager, knew her crew. They were like family, but the whole Starbucks was like family. So I want to shout out to the Lincoln Center Starbucks for making a Texan feel very, very at home for 3 days in July in New York City. So, gentlemen, with that, we had a very successful.
Sounds like, Tom, sounds like she has a Vente heart.
Vente heart. Extra bold.
Actually, I don't know if you saw that, but if you actually take the cups and look at the volume of the cups and pour them into the smaller cup, they all basically fit in the smaller cup. So if you buy the Vente, you should buy the smaller one because it's the same volume of coffee.
On that note, gentlemen, I can't wait to see what we can come up